Howdy folks, how's it hangin', and where you watchin' from? In today's video, I'm gonna spin a yarn about two stubborn neighbors whose feud in Redstone was the stuff of legend until trouble forced them to stand side by side. Clark Henderson and Eli Watson hated each other's guts so long, folks forgot what sparked it. Maybe a crooked fence, maybe a stolen chicken. Their squabbles over that disputed boundary drew crowds like a saloon brawl until a dusty rider galloped in from the south with news that hushed the saloon quieter than a graveyard. A gang of raiders was comin', burnin' everything in their path. Now Clark and Eli had to choose, set aside old grudges and fight together or end up in the same shallow grave. Can two old coots, with tongues sharper than their revolvers, find common ground when dust from enemy hooves is already rising on the horizon? Grab a seat, this tale's gonna be hotter than a desert noon. Redstone dozed under a scorching sun, drowning in dust and laziness. At the well, horses snorted as they drank, and the saloon card slid lazily across the table, and Clark Henderson and Eli Watson were hollering at each other by that cursed fence again. Their patch of land out on the edge of town was a bone of contention. Each swore the other was trespassing. Locals were used to it. Some leaned against walls, listening to the spat. Some bet coins on whose fist would fly first, and some just twirled a finger at their temple. Sheriff Buck, chewing tobacco and squinting at the sun, had long given up on meddling. He knew Clark and Eli would sooner choke each other than talk sense. Clark, wiry, with a face like weathered oak, jabbed a finger at the crooked fence line, claiming Eli moved the stakes. Eli, stocky with a beard like rusty wire, snorted and accused Clark of measuring land with a drunk yardstick. Onlookers chuckled until a rider tore into town on a lathered horse. His face was gray with dust and dread. He slid from the saddle and, gasping for air, rasped, "Raiders! 3 days out. They burn everything." The saloon went dead quiet. Even the flies seemed to hush. Everyone knew these raiders didn't just rob, they left nothing but ash and bones. Next morning, Redstone buzzed like a kicked beehive. Clark Henderson stood on his porch, staring at the horizon where no dust rose yet, but trouble loomed. He clenched his fists as if he could crush the thought of raiders. Eli Watson, grim as a thundercloud, sharpened a knife by his shed, throwing dark glances at Clark's yard. They hadn't spoken since last night, but both knew their fence feud now seemed like kids' play. Clark, teeth grinding, crossed the invisible line dividing their lands. "Eli," he growled, each word scraping his throat, "we gotta hold the line together, or we're done." Eli looked up, smirked crookedly, and said, "Only 'cause I ain't letting you die without my say-so." They shook hands, each gripping like they meant to sprain the other's wrist. They agreed to meet at the saloon that evening to hash out a plan with the townsfolk. Neither was thrilled about this partnership, but there was no choice. That night, the saloon hummed with voices. Tom the shopkeeper, wiping sweat from his brow, suggested setting up mirrors to blind raiders with sunlight. Joe the blacksmith, a giant with hammer-like hands, pushed for a barricade of empty barrels and old wagons. Old Marge, who'd survived 2 land wars, grumbled that prayer and loaded rifles were the only answer. Clark and Eli, seated at opposite ends of a table, kept interrupting each other. Clark wanted to dig trenches along their property line, saying it'd slow down riders. Eli scoffed, calling trenches a fool's mousetrap, and pitched an ambush in the gully by the old trail. Their argument nearly sparked a new fight until Sheriff Buck slammed his fist on the bar. "Time's short," he barked. "Work together, or I'll shoot you both myself to keep you quiet." The crowd murmured but agreed. They needed a plan, fast. Grumbling, Clark and Eli combined their ideas. Trenches for defense, an ambush for attack. That night, they stayed on their lands, checking guns and ammo. Clark, by his fire, cleaned his old Winchester, muttering about the stubborn beard who always meddled. Eli, a few steps across the fence, sharpened an axe, griping that Clark thought too highly of himself. Their voices carried in the quiet, but there was a strange spark in their bickering, maybe respect, maybe habit. At dawn, they spotted hoofprints near the far hill. Clark squinted at the tracks in the dust and said, "Too fresh. They're closer than 3 days." Eli spat in the sand and nodded. "Guess your nose ain't entirely useless." They rode back to warn the town. The air carried a faint whiff of smoke, ominous but thin. Sheriff Buck rallied folks, and by noon, Redstone was prepping. Men hauled logs, women sewed sacks for barricades, even kids carried water. Clark and Eli, despite their jabs, worked side by side, reinforcing trenches. Eli teased Clark when he tripped over a stake. "Don't fall in your own hole, mastermind." Clark snapped back. "Better a hole than your plan to hide like a coyote." But their glares weren't as sharp as before. By the second evening, a scout, a young kid named Sam, rode back from the south. His horse wheezed, and he was paler than chalk. "They're a day out," he gasped. 20 men, maybe more, armed to the teeth. Clark and Eli locked eyes. For the first time in years, they were silent, but their silence said more than words. They knew time was almost up. By noon, Redstone was a beehive, everyone hauling whatever they could. Clark Henderson and Eli Watson, grumbling at each other, dragged logs to their property line, reinforcing trenches. Clark, shirt soaked with sweat, drove stakes with a force like he was pounding Eli's stubbornness. Eli, puffing like an old locomotive, hauled sandbags, tossing barbs. "Hey, Henderson, don't strain yourself. You'll need strength to dig your own grave." Clark snapped back. "Quit yapping, Watson, and check if someone stole your brain with those stakes." Locals chuckled, whispering that these two had finally found common ground in trading jabs. Sheriff Buck, leaning against a wagon, chewed tobacco and watched the town come alive. Women sewed sacks, men sawed boards, and kids darted around with water buckets. Even old Jack, who usually napped in the saloon, dragged out a rusty shotgun, swearing he'd show those bandits a thing or two. By evening, the trenches along Clark and Eli's land took shape. They turned an old wagon into a barricade, bolting it with logs and sacks. Clark, wiping sweat from his brow, muttered, "If your ambush flops, Watson, I'll shove you in this wagon and ship you to the raiders." Eli snorted, "And if your trenches cave, I'll use your skull for target practice." But their words lacked the old venom, more like a ritual they couldn't skip. Townsfolk watching them joked that Clark and Eli were like a married couple, just without the love. By night, exhaustion hit hard. Folks went home, but Clark and Eli stayed by the barricade checking rifles. A coyote howled in the distance, and the stars seemed colder than usual. On the second day, tension thickened. Clark noticed the horses in the corral getting skittish, and dust on the horizon grew heavier. He called Eli over, who squinted and agreed. "Looks like they ain't waiting 3 days." At noon, an old acquaintance of Eli's, a trader named Roy, sidled up, offering to buy his land and skip town before it was too late. Roy, rubbing his hands, said he knew folks who'd pay well. Eli glared at him like he was a scorpion and growled, "I'd sooner give my land to coyotes than your kind." Clark, nearby, couldn't resist. "What's that, Watson? Packing your bags already?" Eli spat in the dust. "Just testing if your head can stop a bullet, Henderson." But he stayed, and Clark, though he hid it, was glad. They kept fortifying, hauling the last barrels to the trenches. Locals, seeing them work in sync, started betting on how many raiders they'd take down together. By the second night, the town went quiet. Clark and Eli sat by a fire, staring at the flames. Clark, tossing a stick into the blaze, told how he lost his brother in a bandit skirmish, died defending someone else's land. Eli, after a pause, muttered that his father went into the desert chasing gold and never came back. Their stories, short and sharp, stung like jabs, but carried pain. Clark snorted, "Your old man probably ran from your sharp tongue." Eli grinned, "And your brother from your pig-headedness?" They fell silent, but the silence was warm as the fire. At dawn, hoofbeats woke them. 2 raiders, scouts, rode up to the boundary. Clark and Eli, without a word, grabbed rifles. Shots rang out almost together, and the scouts, leaving one of their own in the dust, galloped off. Clark glanced at Eli. "Not bad shooting for an old beard." Eli shot back, "And you, for a scrawny grump, ain't half bad." They knew. This was just the start. The town tensed like a coiled spring, bracing for the real storm. By the third morning, Redstone held its breath. A dusty wall on the horizon grew, blotting out the sky like someone wiped it with a rag. Clark Henderson and Eli Watson stood at the barricade, gripping rifles until their knuckles whitened. Clark, scanning the trenches, muttered, "If your ambush flops, Watson, I'll dig you up from hell myself." Eli, checking his ammo, snorted, "And if your pits fail, Henderson, I'll hang your skull on that fence." Their voices drowned in the growing thunder of hooves. Sheriff Buck, perched on the saloon roof, signaled. The raiders were coming. 20-odd riders in leather jackets with faces masked by bandanas charged toward town, kicking up a dust cloud. Their shouts sliced the air like knives, and their horses neighed, sensing the fight. Clark and Eli, without a word, took positions. Clark at the trench, Eli behind the wagon barricade. Townsfolk, armed with whatever they had, rifles, pitchforks, spread out in cover. Blacksmith Joe clutched a hammer. Shopkeeper Tom shook but held a rusty revolver. When the raiders came into view, Clark fired first, aiming at the lead rider. The man dropped, and the rest scattered like wolves sniffing a trap. Eli, taking aim, downed another. "That's one, Henderson, catch up." Clark, reloading, snapped, "Quit yapping, beard, and shoot." Bullets whistled, horses bolted, and the air filled with gunpowder and screams. The raiders tried flanking the trenches, but their horses' hooves sank in the loose dirt Clark had dug. Eli's ambush worked. A few townsfolk, hidden in the gully, opened fire, making the bandits scramble. The fight lasted maybe half an hour, but it felt like forever. Clark, ducking behind a log, took a bullet in the shoulder, but only cursed and kept shooting. Eli, spotting blood, yelled, "Don't you dare die! Henderson, I ain't done arguing with you!" Clark, teeth clenched, shot back, "Not a chance, Watson. I'm still tearing down your fence." They covered each other like lifelong partners. When the Raiders, losing 5 men, started retreating, Clark and Eli climbed from cover and fired a final volley. The dust settled, leaving only heavy breathing and the groans of the wounded. Redstone held, but the barricades were riddled and the ground littered with casings. By evening, the town stirred back to life. Women bandaged the wounded, men hauled water, and old Jack, limping, bragged he'd dropped a bandit with his shotgun. Clark, shoulder-wrapped, sat on the saloon porch sipping whiskey. Eli, face smudged with soot, brought him a mug and grunted, "Don't get comfy, Henderson, this is just round 1. Clark smirked, "You're right, Beard, but my plan worked better." They bickered over whose tactics saved the day until Sheriff Buck barked, "Shut it, both of you, or I'll lock you in a cell." The crowd roared with laughter, and for a moment, Redstone felt almost peaceful. But Clark and Eli knew the Raiders would be back. They locked eyes, and a flicker of respect passed between them, quickly buried under their usual jabs. Victory in Redstone tasted bitter as cheap whiskey. Clark Henderson, shoulder-bandaged, sat on his porch, staring at the bullet-riddled barricade. Eli Watson, wiping sweat from his face, mended a broken shovel from the fight. The town celebrated. Women baked bread, men fixed fences, and kids ran around, retelling how Uncle Clark and Uncle Eli chased off the bandits. But the joy didn't last. At sunset, the scout Sam rode in, face pale as the moon. He slid off his horse and, gasping, said, "The Raiders ain't gone. They're gathering more men. Back in a month." The crowd by the saloon went quiet. Sheriff Buck spat tobacco in the dust and muttered, "Damn, just what we needed." Clark and Eli locked eyes, their silence heavier than words. They knew their uneasy alliance, born of necessity, was now long-term. Next morning, Clark gathered folks by the well. His voice, hoarse from exhaustion, held firm. "We beat 'em once, but they'll come back meaner. We hold the line till they give up or go." Eli, standing off to the side, added, "Or till we shoot 'em all." The crowd murmured, but without much fire. Everyone knew the next wave would be worse. Clark and Eli, without a word, started fixing barricades. Clark, wincing from his shoulder, hauled logs, while Eli, grumbling, packed trenches with sand. Their jabs kept coming, but sounded different. When Clark tripped on a root, Eli snorted, "Watch it, Henderson, don't break your neck. I still got arguments to win." Clark shot back, "Don't worry, Watson. I'll live to tear down your fence." But their glares lacked the old venom. It was more a dance, each knowing the other's steps. The townsfolk worked without rest. Blacksmith Joe forged horseshoes, shopkeeper Tom handed out ammo, and old Marge taught kids to load rifles. Clark and Eli split duties. Clark oversaw trenches. Eli checked the gully for the ambush. They met nightly by a fire, hashing out plans. Clark suggested stringing barbed wire traps to slow riders. Eli, squinting, agreed, but added, "Just don't get tangled in your own traps, genius." Clark grinned. "And you don't hide behind my traps, Beard." Their spats, still sharp, got shorter, like they were saving strength for the real fight. A week later, Sam rode back with news. The Raiders had hired thugs from the next county. Their numbers swelled, around 30 men. Clark, hearing this, slammed a fist on the saloon table. "Then we fight smarter." Eli nodded, or dirtier. They decided to bolster defenses, adding a second trench line and hiding barrels of oil to burn if the Raiders broke through. Townsfolk, seeing their teamwork, whispered that Clark and Eli might not be friends, but were damn good partners. Even Sheriff Buck, chewing tobacco, grunted, "If you two worked like this from the start, I'd be retired by now." By month's end, Redstone looked like a fortress. Trenches were deeper, barricades stronger, and the gully hid the best shooters. Clark and Eli, standing at their property line, checked rifles. Eli, eyeing the sunset, said, "You know, Henderson, if we die, I'll still say your plan was worse." Clark laughed. "And I'll say your fence is crooked, even in the grave." They fell silent, but the silence was light as the evening breeze. For the first time in years, they didn't just tolerate each other, they trusted. The town looked at them and saw not 2 stubborn fools, but a wall that wouldn't break. Dawn in Redstone was cold, despite the sun clawing over the horizon. Clark Henderson and Eli Watson stood at the barricade, eyeing the dust cloud rolling in from the south. 30 Raiders, as the scout had warned, charged toward town, their shouts echoing across the desert. Clark, rubbing his aching shoulder, grumbled, "If your gully fails us, Watson, I'll haunt you from the grave." Eli, checking his revolver, snorted, "And if your trenches collapse, Henderson, I'll drag your fence to hell." Their words, sharp as blades, almost sounded friendly. Sheriff Buck on the saloon roof waved a hand, and the townsfolk took positions. Blacksmith Joe gripped a rifle, shopkeeper Tom shook but held a shotgun, and old Marge aimed from her porch. The fight kicked off as raiders hit the trench line. Horses stumbled in loose dirt, and barbed wire, hidden by Clark, tore at their legs. Eli, from the gully, signaled, and shooters opened fire, dropping the lead riders. Dust choked the air, muffling shouts and gunshots. Clark, behind the barricade, fired until his barrel glowed. Eli, nearby, yelled, "Aim for the middle, Henderson, not the sky." Clark snapped back. "You aim, Beard, or you're just scaring coyotes." But they moved in sync, covering each other. When raiders reached the barricade, Clark lit an oil barrel, and flames cut the bandits off from town. Eli, seeing it, shouted, "Not bad, Henderson, but my shot's better." The battle was fiercer than the first, but shorter. The raiders, losing 10 men, retreated as fire and bullets boxed them in. Clark took a graze on his arm, Eli a bruise from his rifle's kick. They fell in the dust, got up, fired again, until the last rider vanished into the desert. Silence blanketed Redstone, broken only by clinking casings and groans of the wounded. Clark and Eli, panting, leaned against the barricade. Eli spat in the sand. "Well, Henderson, I saved your hide." Clark, wiping blood from his arm, smirked. "Keep dreamin', Watson. I pulled you through." They locked eyes and, for the first time in years, grinned without malice. The town held, and their bond, forged in gunpowder and sweat, had become something more than a forced deal. Redstone buzzed till dawn, celebrating like tomorrow didn't exist. In the saloon, mugs clinked, women sang, and men bragged about how many shots they fired. Clark Henderson and Eli Watson sat on the porch, watching the revelry. Clark, arm-bandaged, sipped whiskey, wincing from pain. Eli, sporting a bruised cheek, held a mug and grumbled, "You nearly torched me with that barrel, Henderson." Clark grinned. "And you shot like you were aiming at coyotes, Watson." Their jabs came lazy, almost warm. Sheriff Buck, passing by, tossed out, "If you two start on that fence again, I'll bury you in a ditch." The crowd roared with laughter, and even Clark and Eli chuckled. By noon, they stood at the disputed fence that started it all. Clark kicked a stake and said, "Maybe we tear this damn thing down." Eli, squinting, replied, "Only if you admit my land's bigger." They locked eyes and without a word shook hands, firm, no tricks. Townsfolk watching whispered, "They actually made peace?" But Clark and Eli were already trading glares like they were gearing up for a new spat. Their alliance saved the town, but old habits died hard. Redstone knew these two would bicker till their last breath, but now it was a different kind of game. Weeks passed, and Redstone settled back into its dusty routine. Clark Henderson and Eli Watson stood by the fence, arguing over whose stake was crookeder. Their bickering, like an old ritual, drew onlookers, but it carried less venom now. Townsfolk retold their story like a legend. Two stubborn fools who saved the town from raiders. Sheriff Buck, chewing tobacco, grumbled they were worse than coyotes, but a smirk flickered in his eyes. Clark, mending the fence, tossed out, "Watson, your plot's still on my land." Eli, sharpening an axe, snorted, "Keep dreamin', Henderson. I'll claim your shed next." Their voices boomed, but everyone knew. If trouble came back, the arguments could wait. Redstone looked at them and saw not just neighbors, but brothers, bound not by blood, but by gunpowder and sweat.